right, so welcome back to another episode of Vikingology podcast, the art and science of the Viking Age. And today is like happy and sad. I'm happy to be able to talk with our guest, Dr. Matthias Nordvik, but I'm also sad that my co-host CJ is not here today. He's feeling a little bit under the weather, so we're going to proceed without him and wish him good health. And he'll be back in our podcast that we'll be doing in a month or so. And so anyways, welcome Matthias to Vikingology podcast.
Thank you so much, Terry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I hope also that CJ is doing well.
Yeah, good. Yeah, exactly. We'll like sacrifice something to Thor after this in order to make his, if that's the right god. I don't know.
That sounds like a good course of action.
Yeah.
I think it's Adam of Bremen that says that they sacrifice to Thor at the Temple of Uppsala for good health as well.
Yeah, so there you go. I don't know. I'm kind of I don't know if it's monotheism or not, but I'm kind of like, I just kind of go to Thor for everything. It's like a catch-all for me.
Well, you got to have that person, right, that you go to. So
Yeah,
it makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, let me just start by saying too, I mean, so you are a professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and you specialize in Nordic mythology and paganism, so the pre-Christian period of the Viking Age, and also Scandinavian folklore, Viking Age studies. And you received your doctoral degree at the University of Aarhus, where I'm headed in about 10 days. So I'm excited to go and see that town, since I've never been there before. But that you're also a podcaster, and so maybe a lot of people will have heard you either on the Nordic Mythology podcast that you do with the co-host, or your new one that you do alone called The Sacred Flame, which I've found to be very interesting. Taking it with me on runs and when I'm out at the farm picking blueberries and all kinds of stuff. And I find it really interesting because it gets at some things that I think about a lot, and that is, connecting the past with the present.
Yeah, thank you for I'm so happy to hear that you listen to it when you pick blueberries, because that's exactly what it's for.
Yeah, it's sort of meditative. And actually, I probably will get to this a little bit later because I wanted to, but I've been rereading the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. And I don't know if you're familiar with that or not, but it's there's some interesting kinds of overlaps a little bit for me, with some of these kind of ancient philosophers. But you and I have spoken once before, and we talked about maybe this being about Viking philosophy. And we do tend to have, themes here in Vikingology that we have with our episodes. And so, myth and philosophy and kind of the wider cosmology. I mean, I'm really interested in that. And I also wanted to just say, so you've got 3 books, which, have the general theme of myth. So you've got, which I really love, Norse Mythology for Kids, Tales of Gods, Creatures, and Quests, great subtitle. And then also, so this one that I want to talk about, so Also True for Beginners. And then also Volcanoes in Old Norse Mythology, Myth, and Environment in Early Iceland. And as you know, I mean, Iceland, I love Iceland, spent a lot of time there. And so to get started, I mean, the volcano is erupting again. So
right.
why don't you tell me, from your space there on high, your very spiritual presence with your light in the background there, what would a Viking Age Nordic person have thought about the eruption of a volcano?
All right. Wow. Okay. Yeah. Going straight into it. Yeah, I do apologize for the halo behind me, but my office is under construction right now, and you can see some boxes and stuff as well. So
entirely appropriate.
Yes. So yeah, what would a Viking have thought about volcanoes? Well, my theory is that they would have approached that situation in the 900s, exactly like what we see other peoples do around the world. And that is by ultimately inserting it in a meaningful context in their worldview. And if we presume that Old Norse mythology was the basis for their understanding of the world, then we may also assume that they would have used Old Norse mythology to make sense of the phenomenon. So what you have in 9th century Iceland is a bunch of Scandinavians and Gaels coming over, settling and building a society. And they do that on basis of these traditional knowledge systems that they brought with them from their respective places. Now, what we know is that the one that becomes most dominant is the knowledge system from Scandinavia. And so it looks like they would have, at least if you believe my research on that, that they would have perceived these phenomena as workings of various kinds of like spiritual entities. I like to call them that rather than gods and giants and all that stuff, because that's more like the cartoon version of it.
Yeah.
And we can see that there is a particular poem that has been preserved in this short story called Bergbúaþáttur. And this is a situation where this guy, he's on a journey across the mountains, and he runs into a blizzard, and then he goes into a cave, and in that cave he sees these two giant eyes staring at him. And it turns out that that is a bergbúi, a mountain dweller. And then this bergbúi starts reciting this poem that is describing volcanic eruptions. This is really the only medieval source that directly, sort of in a tangible way, addresses volcanic eruptions from Iceland. We have, of course, mentions in the annals of there was an eruption over here and an eruption over there and that kind of stuff, just like briefly mentioned. And this has led a lot of scholars to assume that the Icelanders were sort of like shrug about volcanoes. It's like we're talking about the most geologically active place on the planet, and all of these people living here, they were just like, nah, whatever. Some scholars have suggested that, it's only when Christianity comes around that they start getting quote unquote superstitious about it. And my answer to that is that no, that's definitely not the case. Christianity has a different idea about what volcanic activity is. This comes from Pope Gregory the Great, who writes about volcanic eruptions and geologic activity in context of Sicily, and ties it in with the fire and brimstone version of hell. And so this is adopted later on in medieval Iceland. But before that, it looks like what Icelanders did was that they looked at this stuff, and then they were like, well, this is obviously the workings of the Jötnar, with the Æsir involved in some contexts. The poem itself mentions battles between Thor and different Jötnar. Odin is also involved. So what my suggestion is then that what happens is that we get these sort of like cluster motifs, ideas that are very similar to what we see on pretty much the rest of the planet. When it comes to this, we have giant beings, we have birds typically. Sometimes we also have various forms of snakes or large water dwelling animals of various kinds, that are the ones that are sort of the geologic activity is attributed to them. And boom, where do you get that? You get that in Völuspá, the description of Ragnarök. And you also have, of course, the fire giant Surtur, who comes out of the ground with a flaming sword. And what I try to do in context of all of this is to locate perhaps the origin of these narratives and motifs in context of actual historical eruptions. And what we have right around 930 is this massive eruption called Eldgjá that had hemispheric impact. We know that it disrupted farming in China and southwestern Asia. And if that is the case, if it did that, if Icelandic eruption did that, then it must have had a lot of impact on Iceland as well. And what is the comparable example? Well, that's Lakagiga in 1783 to 4, where we see a massive volcanic eruption that has impact on the European continent in terms of gases that kill a lot of people. It impacts the way that the sky looks. We have plenty of interesting descriptions of it from England, for instance, in the late 1700s. And of course, what it also does is that it impacts life directly in Iceland. We see in some counties close to the eruption, I think it's around 20 to 25% of the population die. Primarily because of fluoride contamination of the feed for the animals, so the sheep die. And we have this wonderful description, or wonderful, I don't know if it's wonderful, but it's an interesting description of it, at least, in the Eldrit, these narratives that are being written from, I think the oldest one is from the beginning of the 1600s. These are descriptions of volcanic eruptions in Iceland in this period. And it looks like those Eldrit are primarily being created because this is a way to get the attention of the Danish king far, far away, and essentially send him a list of damages and say, can we have compensation, please? Because a lot of them come with these lists of, we lost so and so much, and he does send compensation for this stuff. And so we have this description of the Lakagiga and eruption, and it's actually quite similar to some of the stuff that we see in earlier literature, where the lava flows are compared to rivers. The boulders that are coming in the lava flows are compared to whales, swimming in the fire rivers and such. And so when we look at this globally, we see similar ways of talking about volcanic eruptions. So this looks like a very common human way of actually just trying to conceptualize what it means that the Earth is all of a sudden on fire and exploding. Yeah. So yeah, that's what I did there.
Yeah. What or I should say, where is the volcano that you mentioned erupted in 930?
The Elkjau is in the same system as the Lakagiga eruption, and this is a system that goes from Mýrdalsjökull. So Katla, that's under Mýrdalsjökull, is part of that system, and then it goes all the way sort of northeast towards Vatnajökull. And you can have different types of eruptions there in different ways. Like the typical Katla eruption is actually just, what the Icelanders traditionally have called Kötluhlaup, which only presents itself as glacial water bursts that come out under Mýrdalsjökull. And there's an interesting folktale attached to that as well, with a witch who has these pants that lets her run really fast, and then because of a killing, she ends up committing suicide in the crevices of the Mýrdalsjökull, and then these Kötluhlaup are associated with her, and her name is Katla, just like the volcano. So there you go.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, it's interesting, and some of the listeners may know, I mean, in Neil Price's book, Children of Ash and Elm, he, talks about this kind of volcanic, phenomenon, but in the 6th century, right? Mm-hmm. Two of them, not in Iceland, but in other places in the world. Well, one I think he says is actually unknown, but one is where, like El Salvador or someplace like that. And but having this kind of worldwide effect, darkening of the sky and all of that kind of stuff, and that potentially there's some, that playing a role in kind of the reset button, right? And what ends up sort of setting up what ultimately will become Viking Age society. I think,
Yeah, no, it does look like the so-called dust veil event,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
In the
yeah,
530s, 35, I think it is, seems to have had a strong impact on Scandinavia, and it makes perfect sense, considering that if you have a volcanic eruption somewhere in the world that blankets the globe, or at least parts of the globe, then in the northern parts, we will have, summers with very low productivity on the fields. We saw that in the 19th century too. What was it, the Krakatau or Krakatoa?
mhm,
Yeah.
yeah,
As one example of this, and yeah, that has direct real world impact on people, right? So I think, if I remember the numbers correctly from what Neil Price has written in other research articles on this, we see, is it in north central Sweden, like something like 70% of farms are abandoned in certain locations.
yeah,
And so, where did the people go? is a really interesting question, right?
yeah,
Did they just die off? I don't think so. I think what this contributed to more migrations out of Scandinavia. So yeah, it's definitely an important factor
yeah,
in the political dynamics of Europe in this period, just as it is elsewhere. And we can see that, in archaeology in Ecuador. There's an interesting example. This population right around the year zero, I think it's in the year 90, where there's a cataclysmic volcanic eruption that impacts the valley that they live in. And what we can see from the archaeology of this population, is that they are, um, uh, they seem to be what we would classify as a peaceful society. They're not farming a lot of crops. They have one or two types of crops that they're farming. They don't engage in a lot of warfare. They just hang out, so to speak, and live their best lives. And then they get impacted by this volcanic eruption. And what we can see is that the survivors, they move to the coast, where they then live for a couple of 100 years. And then they return to their original homeland, which suggests that they would have kept stories alive about all of this.
mhm,
And the type of society that returns is entirely different. It's a relatively steep warrior hierarchy, very aggressive. They have multiple types of crops. They forage, they hunt, and they also prey on their neighbors. So it looks like this population has completely changed their mindset and ideas about what to do for resilience and survival.
right,
And I'd actually say that Iceland looks like a similar type of society in this period. That's sort of like becomes worse and worse in the early period of Icelandic settlement, where you have these very aggressive landlords, essentially, who are competing with each other over resources. And it makes perfect sense, because Iceland is also, although Scandinavians, especially northern Scandinavians, would be well familiar with ways of farming in Arctic or subarctic conditions, Iceland is still different from
mhm,
Norway,
yeah,
and the rest of Scandinavia. And so it looks like they become more and more aggressive over time, just basically hoarding resources. And this, turns into a very steep patriarchal warrior society that then, ultimately succumbs to itself, so to speak, in the 13th century, where their infighting and rivalries become a weakness to them. So the Norwegian king can swoop in and be like, now I'm king over the whole thing. So I think actually
go ahead.
sometimes we should consider that such geologic event can have really like big impact on the direction a society will take eventually
Yeah,
later on.
yeah, because definitely I think Price, sets that up for those 6th century volcanoes, even though they aren't in Iceland, but it does affect things. And the reset button results in a similar phenomenon, this warrior kind of militarized society. Which I mean, I guess, yeah, I mean, it totally makes sense to me as far as if you're, you go through something cataclysmic like that and you happen to be amongst the survivors, then it's pretty much Mad Max, I mean, and everybody's just trying to survive. I mean, in an odd way, I mean, I can't relate to that, warrior part of it, but I mean, here where I am in Portland, I mean, I was a kid when Mount St. Helens erupted. And,
Mm.
it's not very far from the Portland area. And on top of that, my mom had decided to take me and my sister to like a weekend little getaway in Vancouver, British Columbia. And we were like heading back, south through the state of Washington. And then it's like the mushroom cloud is there. We're like, what the heck is going on here? Because that hadn't happened for like anybody's lifetime, and having to get completely rerouted and whatever in order to finally get home. But then what happened afterwards, just as far as, I mean, the dust veil is real, let me tell you that
Hmm.
much, and the fact that you get home and there's like whatever silica or, volcano, whatever, detritus, like all over everything.
Yeah.
And people didn't understand. I mean, people were like wearing sort of rudimentary masks or this or that, but nobody really understood. I mean obviously scientifically we knew what was going on, but nobody had ever had to deal with it before, and so it was an interesting time.
Yeah, and see, this is exactly why those stories exist, right? Those stories exist in cultural memory in populations that have experienced volcanic eruptions before, exactly so that we know what to do.
Yeah.
And so what you can see in some of the myths that I would call volcanic narration, or at least they have an affinity to volcanic narration, because I don't think that they're just about that. They're about a lot of different things. That's what cultural narratives are always about, right?
Yeah.
But what you can see in some of the Icelandic ones is that they follow step by step what actually happens in volcanic eruptions. The story about the meat of poetry is actually, if you ask me, built on a framework that relates to volcanism, with like earth tremors before an actual eruption, all of this stuff. You can, if you know what happens in a volcanic eruption and you read that story, you'll be like, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah, this is what they're talking about.
And
Yeah.
this is what you see, the Pacific Ring of Fire. If you look at the populations living from Aotearoa all the way up to Alaska and all the way down, you will see that these populations have stories like these
Yeah.
that will, suggest that to you. I just saw on CNN the other day that an oarfish had been spotted. Some divers encountered a large oarfish off the coast of Japan. And the interesting thing about that was that it just mentioned briefly that in Japanese traditional storytelling, there are the oarfish are associated with earthquakes. They say that they will appear before earthquakes. I don't know if that is part of the behavior of oarfish, but it totally makes sense to me that if, in Japan, you've seen oarfish in context of earthquakes, that will be compounded in such narratives.
Yeah, interesting. So, okay, so then I'm going to back up a little bit just in the whole sense of, kind of what we're getting at here with, these belief systems and ways of being in the world. And, I mean, most people, especially people who know you or have listened to your podcast or whatever, I mean, there's, especially for our podcast too, like, the English speaking audience, mostly like UK, United States, what have you, that will probably have some rudimentary understanding of, if I say the word Norse mythology, like what that means, right? At least if it's nothing more than from the Marvel universe or something, right? I mean, they'll know we're talking about like some pre-Christian, pagan, as it's, they call it, a polytheistic system of various deities and spirits and things like that. And quite frankly, I have to say, for my class that I teach on kind of an intro to Viking history, I mean, this is what a lot of students come to me. It seems to be either A, they've got Scandinavian heritage or something, Vikingish that they think, and they kind of want to see what that's about, or B, they know about Norse mythology and they love it and they want to know more. But kind of beyond getting into sort of what that is, you know, talking about who's Odin, who's Thor, all of that kind of stuff. I mean, people can Google that, I guess. But I'd like to speak about it more in kind of the general mindset of what it meant to be, you know, a Nordic person in the world at that time. And I mean, we're kind of getting at a bit about it, you know, with sort of how would you react to a volcanic eruption, or how would they react to a volcanic eruption? But I mean, how, as far as your research has told you, how did Nordic peoples understand their place in the cosmos?
Mm-hmm.
You know, which of course is, you know, different from the Christian understanding and what that's going to sort of implant and impose and what have you. But you know, give us a sense of that.
Yeah, so to me, it looks like first and foremost, I would say that understanding your world in the cosmos has everything to do with the environment around you. And this is something that we can see in very recent folk tales from Scandinavia too. There are so many folk tales from the Danish area that are about flooding and lakes and such things, and they involve trolls and all kinds of what we would call mythological beings today. When you go to Norway, it's rock slides and other sort of, you know, mountainous activity. And when you go to Sweden, there's a lot of forest dwelling creatures of various kinds, right? So that already there tells you that, you know, based on the Scandinavian environment, people have come up with ways of understanding what that environment is and what it does, and bringing in an element of presumed intention behind it, right? So when there's a rock slide, the intention is that there was, you know, there's a troll over there that had the intention to kill me, right? That's what that is. So that means, of course, that these peoples, and this goes for, again, from all populations on the planet, in some distant past or not so distant past, they have seen themselves and placed in the cosmos around with all of these other entities around them, acting and behaving from their own logic, right? And this is, I think this is really important, because when we talk about mythologies and religion, we think about it in terms of like belief in something. And I would say that this is not actually the same thing as belief. This is a sense of meaning making. And that meaning making then may turn into attempts to communicate with these entities. And what that can then express itself as is ritual. And so I'm sure there's a bunch of scholars of religion that are like, you know, having spasms right now as I'm saying this, because what I'm then into their ears suggesting is that religion comes from nature, right? And human nature relationships. And that is only partially true, of course, because then you have other religions like Christianity that is, or at least becomes, a very urban religion. It has urban religious elements to begin with, but then later on becomes very urbanized, right? But you also see expressions of Christianity that are very similar to what I presume pre-Christian religion in Scandinavia was like. Again, Scandinavia is a great example, right? These folk tales, they exist alongside with Christianity. So that and what it looks like is that in medieval Scandinavia, Christianity is a very sort of, for lack of a better term, nature-centered type of religion to the general public. So what I would say is happening in that pre-Christian period is sort of an interplay between this what we would call biosacral type of religion, a religion that understands the world as imbued with different kinds of spirits, essentially, that we can communicate with, and we need to communicate with them because they're the ones that are in control over the growth of whatever we put in our fields and need to harvest to eat. They're the ones that are in control over the animals that are present around us that we can hunt, the fish in the water, and so on. So that's what we need to focus on. And then on the other side, then you have societal development that then introduces new ideas around all of this, and also comes up with ritualistic practices for that are specifically for societal human communal interaction in different ways. And this is where, for instance, we get all the nonsense about Valhalla and Odin as some kind of like warrior king and all that stuff. That's because, you know, in the 500s, possibly influenced by the upheavals of that Dust Veil event, by the way, we get little landed rulers, landed kings of some kind. What we see is also that, you know, these central sites become more and more popular. These locations where you have a hall with some kind of temple-like structure. Scandinavian archaeologists like to call it cult houses to avoid the term temple.
I don't think. Hof.
Yeah, that's sort of like the cult house is sort of the Scandinavian attempt to translate Hov. And I think we're just playing word games with all of that. They're temples.
Yeah.
We have temple structures. They're just not temples in the sense of like those, you know, cool Roman temples and all that stuff, right? And so it's like you have this little ruler that creates that little space that also has economy attached to it. There's usually seasonal markets, industry in terms of smithies and other, you know, production of textiles and so on, right in one single location. And this is where that ideology that attaches warrior retinue to a hall, to a ruler, to Odin really comes from. This is when that is created, and that then becomes part of the dynamics of the Viking Age, right? This is we sort of get more and more a direction towards single rulers who you know, hold power over a lot of land. This is, of course, also helped by Frankish feudalism that starts permeating the north in this period as well. There's the establishment of hunting parks, for instance, in the 7th century, I think it is, in southern Scandinavia, which suggests that the elite is monopolizing hunting, just like they're doing in the Frankish Empire. Yeah. And what is monopolizing hunting? Well, it is basically to tell everybody else that they can't hunt. What does that mean? Well, it's an enclosure of resources that you're essentially taking these resources away from the general public and saying this is your privilege to do that. And that, of course, then also means that the general public will then have to rely on whatever they can grow in their fields and barter and buy, right? Which will funnel more resources back to you as the little, you know, ruler of that central site. Yeah. So you have like these two different developments, right? This communication with the natural world around us, and then the communication between social institutions, essentially. And that's what generates the material that we then have written down in Snorri Sturluson's Edda and Eddic poetry and other sources from, you know, the high medieval period in the 13th century primarily. And what that is, I would say, is one, primarily whatever the elite could gather of material that was still circulating, right? Skaldic poetry about kings and heroes, a few about gods, Eddic poetry that has been used for entertainment, whatever folk tales and stories that Snorri Sturluson heard or read in the learning center at Otti, where he grew up, right? Mm-hmm. So what we really have is the watered down version of everything. We don't have that awesome access that we could have had to the minds of everyday people in the 800s. We have um we have sort of the faint ghost of that, unfortunately.
Yeah, this is the thing that Price does refer to as the Viking mind, that he tries to get at. And I know one of the things that I've found interesting that I mean, and it's so simple, but the way he phrases it in one of his, I can't even remember which one, but I mean, like you were saying earlier, I mean, this isn't a belief system. This is a way of knowing. It's like these people didn't believe these things; they knew them, right? It's, to me, it's just so interesting, and I think you and I have talked about this before. This way of actually being in the world and living in the world in ways that I think in the post-industrial, like we're like sort of trying in fits and starts in various ways to kind of get back to that. But I think it's very difficult because we don't have that same sense of feeling. And not only, sort of the post-industrial world, but also, of course, when Christianity does affect things as far as this imposition of an idea that suggests somehow human beings are like above or separate, because then that means they can exert dominance and control and sort of bend nature to its will, which, how are we doing on that? Not,
Right.
not
Good luck,
very.
guys.
Yeah, exactly. But it is interesting to me, as I mentioned before, about like looking again at the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, and he actually, I marked this out. I totally was thinking about you because there's this one passage where he says, you must always keep this in mind. What is the nature of the whole with a capital W, right? What is my nature, and how is my nature related to that greater nature with a capital N? Also, that nobody can hinder you from constantly doing and saying what is in keeping with nature, capital N, of which you are a part. And when you look at the glossary in this particular compilation or translation, they say, well, what he means by nature is like what you just said. It's like that which makes things grow and essentially sustains life. And it's kind of like we are part of this. And yet we're sort of having to relearn that, which is, sort of, I guess, can be seen as positive in that we are taking steps, at least in some ways, to do that. But in other ways, it's kind of sad, isn't it, that we forgot this very sort of fundamental thing that, that this animist part about, at least for me, in the way I see it, that, I mean, everything is alive and deserves that sort of respect as a living being, whether it's a rock or a river or, a bird or whatever. And so, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, so Stoic philosophy, I would say in many ways is the Greco-Roman attempt to keep a type of animism alive in their societies, and it seems like they were actually for a long time quite successful in doing that. I mean, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, is an example of that, right? The person that we in his time in the Roman society we may assume was probably most detached from natural processes, right? He's the one
Right.
who's got most resources coming to him and doesn't have to do anything for it.
Hence the meditations, though. He's struggling with that. You can clearly tell. Yeah.
Absolutely, right. But see, he understood this. He knew, right? In Scandinavian scholarship, we tend to say that Christianity was the biggest, I would say, at least traditionally, we've seen scholars saying was the biggest break with tradition in Scandinavia. Christianity caused the most changes, and I would say that is not the case. What really caused the most changes, and that doesn't go for that's not exclusive to Nordic societies. It's a global phenomenon. Is the Industrial Revolution. That is the biggest break humanity has ever had with traditional ways of living compared to whatever else came after. And what we can see from this break with traditional ways of living is that has been detrimental to us. It starts it has different beginnings depending on where we're at, right? You can go back in time and trace an event here and an event there and so on, and see that had impact on how we would later come to think about ourselves in the world. The dismantlement of the enclosures in England is an important historical moment for all of this. The Lord's appropriation of all natural resources in the Prussian Empire is another important event. The invention of the modern schooling system in the Prussian Empire is another important event. William the Conqueror's conquest of England and his subsequent colonization of the Anglo-Saxon lands is another important event, right? And then his colonies or his descendants' colonization of Ireland is another important event for all of this. And then it's sort of like all it comes together historically into this landed aristocratic elite, especially in England and France, that has the means of production in the Industrial Revolution at their hands, and that is when, pardon my language, shit hit the fan.
Yeah, exactly.
Because what happens to the European populations is that they are ultimately completely, it's been a long process where they've slowly been detached more and more from their places of living, but with the Industrial Revolution, they're completely torn out of their original places of living, right? We see mass migrations to urban centers and mass migrations out of Europe to distant continents, right? This country is a result of that, right?
Exactly.
And what happens internally in Europe is a lot of violence on all levels, right? From individual to individual, state to individual, to state between state, right? Wars everywhere, constantly. And that also has a spillover effect on the rest of the world, where we see colonization, we see genocide by Europeans across the Americas, in Africa, in Australia, the rest of the planet, really, right?
Yep.
And that then further serves to detach the populations outside of Europe from their places of living and their traditional narratives, their meaning making of the world. And then eventually we end up in this weird system that we live in today, where more and more and more of us are detached, and we have this category for people that are presumed to not be detached. That's indigenous peoples, right? That then are fighting to hold on to their land. And one of the things that you can see is that the highest rate of biodiversity is on indigenous hands today. Like the areas in the world that are governed by indigenous peoples are the areas in the world that are best off, and the rest of us are destroying whatever we have left.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, this is a preaching to the choir moment, because I actually, in my teaching career, I've had, periodically to teach, sections of, what was kind of the old Western Civ sort of thing. Essentially, it was European history from the 18th to the 20th century. And I like day one, I'm telling myself, okay, I'm a medievalist historian by training. There's a reason for that. I think the Industrial Revolution is the worst catastrophe that ever happened to humans in all of its history, and potentially, with the exception maybe of modern medicine on some level, just in that life extension a little bit, or a little bit better health potential. I'll trade this for the Middle Ages any day. I know, obviously, I know that's quite a general sort of weird statement to some people, but I mean, because of what you're talking about, it's just like, I think the 19th century is just like the worst century in all of human history. I would not have wanted to be alive there. But to me, as a historian, and you see this, when you have the long view, it's like, that is a hard pendulum swing to, it's like, centuries upon centuries of people who basically, unless you were, rich, are the vast majority of the people are subsistence living, right? And you're just trying to get by. And so maybe you can't on some level blame them for, you get to this point where they're like, oh, and we can do this and we can do that, and yay, and then just push it so far without any maybe blatant disregard for some of them, but just complete ignorance, quite frankly, for
Mhm.
many of them. They don't know, right, what it is that they're getting into when they're pushing the pendulum to these extents. And now we're living in the time where that is becoming glaringly apparent, uh,
Right. Yeah.
in lots of ways. So
And I would say that, the reason that they went in that direction back then is because they lost their elders. They lost their elders long, long before. If you go to indigenous cultures and you see the workings of their elders, they will not necessarily just adopt any new technology or whatever else comes to them. There will be many different, deliberations usually in such cultures. Is this good for us? Is this meaningful? Why do we need it? All of that
yeah,
kind of stuff, right? Whereas, today we just have like this slap happy idea about any new technology that's presented to us. It's like, oh, this is a good thing. It's like, why would it be a good thing? um like,
yeah,
that's how our societies have changed. And this is probably, I would say, also why um so many indigenous peoples here in North America refer to us white people as, the younger people, right?
right,
Those who didn't grow
right,
up. And I also, I want to stress too that, this is, when I'm saying these things, I'm not saying, oh well, you're a white American, you descend from settlers and colonizers, so you're a bad person or anything like that. I don't agree with that way of looking at people. Because what we need to understand that this is a process that is out of people's control as well. Like, those people in the 19th century, as you just pointed out, right? Like, the subsistence living, and actually in very poor conditions because they were constantly being exploited by the elite classes, right? They were looking for ways to actually just survive. And one of the ways, look at Ireland, was to leave Ireland for North America, right? And
right.
you see the same thing with Scandinavians. There are millions of Norwegians and Swedes in particular who are leaving. Well, why? Well, it's because farming sucks
Yeah,
in Norway and,
yeah,
and
right,
Sweden at that time.
yeah,
And you have these oppressive systems too,
yeah,
with a landed elite. Of course, it's like in the 19th century, it's becoming less so oppressive, but it's still quite oppressive.
yeah,
The same is the case for Denmark, although it looks like we have fewer people leaving Denmark for North America. I think that might also come down to the Dano-German wars in this period that leave more and more land in German hands. So migrants are counted as Germans rather than Danes.
right,
So it might actually be similar numbers from Denmark, from the old Danish territory at least.
yeah.
So ultimately, what we're seeing is, of course, that people who live in under those conditions, they will look for new opportunity, right? Then opportunity becomes an ideology, and boom, you have modern America.
Yeah,
Right?
although I have to say, when I'm teaching my Viking class, I'll say, like, those people were opportunistic in the extreme, in my estimation, as well. But it's for a different reason, I think. Well, no, actually, no, it's not. It's a different context, but the reason is the same. They're like trying to better their conditions, whatever that means. So I mean, opportunism, I think, is just part of being human, quite frankly. But
Yeah, I mean, there with that period from the 500s up to the maybe like 1100s.
uh,
What you see in Scandinavia, similar dynamics as the ones that you see in Europe broadly, in the 19th, 20th, and early 20th century. Um, you have power hoarding by elites in Scandinavia from the 500s and onwards.
right,
This is what we then call the emergence of the Scandinavian nations, whatever that means.
yeah,
Uh, I'd like to call them polities instead, because
yeah, I
we
do too. Yeah,
we don't have a coherent populations like that,
yeah,
as
right,
in the same way as we do in the 19th century, when the nations are actually invented, right?
right,
Um, and this is what is also expressed in the saga literature, right? We have these situations. I really like the one in Laxdœla saga where
Oh, that's
you
my
have,
favorite.
yeah,
Fun.
you have these deliberations, right, where Chetit, he calls the entire family together. And when I say family in this regard, we have to think of a much more expansive system than those like nuclear families that were invented in the late 19th century and promoted as the norm in the 1950s.
Yeah.
We have a much more expansive family structure, and they all come together and then they deliberate and say, look, that king over there in West London, he's he's going to try to usurp our lands. He's probably going to kill us. Or if he doesn't kill us, he's going to make us subject to him. And we don't want that. So what do? Well, we could stay and fight. Yeah, well, let's leave.
Yeah.
Let's go find better lands somewhere else. And then
Yeah.
you have that journey
Yeah.
that goes through Scotland, the Faroe Islands, Orkneys, and then eventually to Iceland, right?
Yeah.
Um, and these are the things that people had to consider,
Yeah.
and still have to consider as soon as you have a society that goes towards dictatorship rather than pluralism, right? These are like the two extremes in that sense, right?
Right.
Then you will have people who have to ask themselves, well, do I want to stay in this, or do I want to go somewhere else that seems better, right?
Yeah.
And that seems to have been a dynamic in Scandinavia in the Viking Age. I mean, why are there so many place names in
Yeah.
the Danelaw
Yeah.
that come from Scandinavia? It's probably because England was also receiving a lot of Scandinavians that were tired of whatever was happening in Scandinavia
Yeah.
in this period.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I mean, so it's an eternal human story, quite frankly.
yeah,
Just
the
kind of,
irony of it all is, of course, that in Scandinavia, we herald this period as like the period where our states became states and all of that stuff. And in Denmark, we can count our royal lineage all the way back to Harold Bluetooth. And it's like, is that a good thing? It doesn't seem like it to me.
okay, so wait, okay, so yeah, that reminds me then of something that, like you just said, that I wanted to circle back to, and that was the thing about elders. So yeah, I was just you saw I actually posted on Instagram like my great grandparents, right? And so I got that from my cousin, who he's like my second cousin, and I met him like once before, but then we kind of reconnected just recently, and so we were zooming and talking about this, heritage and this and that, and he was talking about having one of our ancestors who he was close to or whatever, passing away recently, and that his wife, who was also close to this person, had this dream that they like touched them. They like I felt this hand on my back. It was him. I know it. I can't explain it. It sounds weird, whatever. And he's like, no, because I just had that dream literally like 3 days ago, where like this, that I had touched this person's arm just to let them know I was there right before they passed. And then I feel this touch on my arm, whatever. And he's like, isn't that weird? And I said, from my understanding of it, that's a very, sort of Nordic way of thinking about it in the pre-Christian period, again, that we're talking about, is this idea of, sort of whatever it is that you want to call it, that separates the living from the dead, that it's way more porous in that period of time, and that, that there is, ancestor worship to a degree or whatever, but that those people may have passed, but they never really leave, right? And like my Icelandic friends, right, like the fylkja, sort of the thing that inhabits you, that can also be somewhat related to the previous generations and stuff. So can you speak to that a little bit, just about this idea of, the importance of, I mean, because you just mentioned it too, right? The family, not the nuclear family. We know that the importance in the Viking Age of the sort of the extended kin network. But it also just speaks to sort of the wider, I don't want to say belief again, but you know what I mean, the wider acceptance of just the importance of the connection that you have to the people who are with you, but the people who came before you.
Yeah. Well, so what it looks like is we humans, we have communities that are these material, physical, tangible communities of humans around us in spaces, right? And then it looks like we have the exact same kind of community, essentially, with those who have passed, at least in a traditional society. Um, and well, what does that look like in a Scandinavian context? Well, there's a reason that the Scandinavian region is littered with mounds. These mounds that have been built over people who died. And the mound building culture exists from the early Stone Age in Scandinavia all the way up until Christianity. Like this was the tradition, right? So this, what it looks like is, if you ask me, is that these populations that existed from the Stone Age and up until they converted to Christianity, they have had similar ideas around community with the dead. Some of those mounds that were built back in the Stone Age and Bronze Age, they were communal spaces. They were spaces where multiple ancestors were buried or in other ways interred, right? And you could walk into them. I've actually been inside these. It's a really funky feeling.
Not like walking into a modern mausoleum or something. It's got a different, because the idea kind of seems similar to me, right?
Yeah, well, you're going into the realm of the dead.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
what that is, right?
Right. Or
Like
like a
once,
catacomb in Rome or something.
yeah,
Yeah.
once you crawl in through that little space that can sort of like fit a person when you're on your hands and knees, and then you get into the inside of this mound, then you're in the world of the dead. And what do we see in the Viking Age? Well, it looks like in the Viking Age, we get a lot more and mind you, I'm not an expert on burial practices, and I'm just basing this off of what I know. Um, it looks like you get a lot more innovation in burial practices, and but as Neil Price also says, that even though there's innovation, there are also very constantly common ideas, structures, and practices in place, right? So you get innovation within a coherent framework of this is how we do it.
Mhm.
Um, and one of my favorite ones is a grave that's built as a chamber grave that kind of looks like a house structure, where you have a single woman that was interred in there. She was put in a chair, and I think she was held up by ropes so that she would look like she was sitting. And there's a little chest next to her, and that on that chest there's a candle that has been burnt several times, which means somebody has been going in there and hanging out with her
Yeah.
after her death.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And we get those chamber graves in the Viking Age. They seem to be close to urban centers, like Hedeby and Birka are examples of them. And this seems to be a very distinct sort of like Viking era practice that doesn't exist before that, and it of course disappears with Christianity. But also keep in mind that there's always an overlap period. There are some Christians that are buried with grave goods as well, right? So the old ideas don't go away. So what basically what all of this tells us, everything that we can see with the furnishing of these graves, the building of these graves, is that there was so much care for the dead. We were so concerned with them being comfortable in the afterlife that we put all this food, clothes, weaponry, animals, all kinds. Like peacocks even show up in some of these graves,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But just to make sure that they have what they need, right? And then it seems like the afterlife of the grave was prolonged and extended in different ways for different reasons. But the primary connecting point is always communication with the dead. And so this you can see in the folklore as well later on, that these ideas, they stay with us in different ways. The best example I would say is sort of the more negative versions of all of this. There are Norwegian folk tales about when when you pass grave mounds on the road at night, you have to be very careful because the hulder, they will offer you a drink of a drinking horn, and then when you say no, they throw it at you, and then it hits the horse and the horse melts because it's acid or something like that. It goes like wild sort of horror stories, right? And that's because this is an old tradition of actually communicating with the hidden people in the mound, right? That we're then trying to undermine in this 19th century era or 18th century era, where we want to get rid of all of that quote unquote superstition, right?
Right.
And that's also why you have folk tales about being invaded on Christmas Eve by the trolls, right? And they come and they hold a big party in your house and trash everything. And again, like the old story, I'm sure, was that all your ancestors would come to you on Christmas Eve and you would have a really nice time, right? And so now we have the inverse situation because we want to keep the dead, right?
Yeah.
And you have old traditions too of setting up a table, even making a bed for the Toonkak, right? The farm man, essentially. Again, that's an ancestor who's supposed to come in and be part of your celebration of Christmas Eve. So yeah, they were always there. They are always there. They're always walking with you in this Scandinavian way of thinking, the traditional Scandinavian way of thinking. And again, it's only once industrialization rolls around that we stop believing in that.
Yeah. Okay. So so this is now getting me a couple different things here, especially with relationship to your book about Ausatru. So Ausatru, I'll have you explain a little bit about what that is here in a second, because it's kind of a modern interpretation, a way of bringing back some of the old ways. But I'm also interested in the idea of when we talk about these old traditional modes of being and what potential benefits those can have for us now, or needing to bring them back because we've lost something that sort of is essential to what it means to be human, at least in my estimation. But as a historian, I also sort of like to think about the idea of this running, when does it run a risk of like, okay, we have to preserve tradition, and it was too bad we got rid of the old way. I don't know why I'm going like this. I always talk with my hands, like that's the past, this is the future.
Right.
But the fact that we look at it and I mean, people throughout time have done this sort of like, rose-colored glasses, the golden ages in the past kind of thing, and lamenting what we've lost and why don't we do that anymore. And so I always sort of like to think as time and history in the human experience sort of flows like a river, or at least that's how I kind of envision it in my mind, it's always moving and it's sort of organic. And like, what is this impulse to kind of stop time at a certain point and think, yeah, that's when it was good and that's what we should do again. And so with the idea of Ausatru and kind of trying to sort of bring some of this back or re-inhabit that space again, do you think about that? Do you think about it in terms of, running the risk of like, the modern world just sucks. Let's just go ahead and go back to that because that was really great. Because obviously, if you look at it, with a real sort of, microscopic lens, I mean, you're going to see some, like you said before, excuse the language, some shitty things that were part of that way of being as well, right? I mean, nothing is all good or all bad. So Ausatru, and then how do you avoid sort of this golden age kind of thinking about tradition?
Yes. Well, let me start with this golden age way of thinking about the past. So personally, the way that I avoid it is, and I hope I don't offend anybody by saying this, but I think nostalgia and sentimentalism are pathetic sentiments. Honestly, that's my personal opinion. Others may have a different idea about it. And why do I do that? Well, that's because I know it's just a mirage. and this hankering for a past era, longing for something that once was, that I want to bring back. Well, one, you can never do that. You can
Right.
never bring the past back. Not even the 1950s can come back in today. That's not how it is.
Right.
So what you're always going to be doing is you're going to be reenacting or recreating a period in the present, right? And that means that you're doing that on the premise of the present, which means it's never going to be that.
Right.
Like it's a philosophically impossible to do, right?
Right.
Or it's an improbability. So that means, first of all, that we should always, in my opinion, comport ourselves as if we're living in the present. Now, but when it then comes to building a way of thinking uh, today in the present around cultural material that existed in the past, well, what we need to do is we need to find the connecting point, right? We are reestablishing, retying a thread to the past because the past has good things. And we're looking at those good things, and then we are trying to manifest them in our present, essentially, right? That's how I look at it. Um, is the Viking Age, for instance, or that period between the Viking Age and the 13th, 14th century, when all of this stuff is written down in Iceland, and stories about the Viking Age and all this. Is that the preferred era? No, 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 not for me. But that's what I got. That's what I have to work with. I think things looked a lot better for many different reasons before the Viking Age in Scandinavia, and different societies at different points have that sort of like an era where things seem to be. And here's the thing: we shouldn't think about this in terms of like golden ages or everything is perfect or anything like that. We should think about this in terms of what leaves the best opportunities for humans to exist the way that they want to. Right? That's how I look at it, right? And what can we see historically with the Scandinavian societies? Well, we know that Scandinavian societies had what we would call a type of like I loathe the term, but tribal structures um, in sort of like up until the Viking era. And the Viking era, that's when we get more something that closer resembles the European idea of state structures,
Yeah,
right?
social stratification in that kind of, yeah, feudal
Yeah,
hierarchical way, even though technically it isn't feudalism, but yeah.
yeah, and it's sort of it, as I said before, it starts in the 500s, but it's a long, long, long process of development.
Right.
And if you look historically at different societies, you can see many different developments. Go to south of the American border and look at the types of societies that existed pre-Spanish conquest and also during the Spanish conquest, which did take a while. You find everything from stratified hierarchical societies like the Aztecs to what looks like republics. I think it's Tlaxcala that was a type of republic, for instance. And go to the Mayan cities on the Yucatan, and what do you see there? You see pluralistic type societies where, for instance, women have a very dominant role. You can even sort of like trace, like, I mean, it's fascinating to actually look at the history of Yucatan, because what you have is, I mean, that the colonization doesn't even seem to succeed until very recently, if it even has, like, you know, with a lot of the indigenous communities there. And my point with all of this is that, well, we as human beings, we come from these different cultural contexts around the world. I come from a Scandinavian cultural context, and what interests me is ways of living for us humans that actually serve our purpose of being human. And what I can see is that the post-industrial society does not serve our purpose of being human. What we at best get are institutions and technologies and structures that exploit our humanity in different ways. Just look at social media. It's social media. And it's media that's exploiting our propensity to have social connections,
Right.
our interest in and willingness to communicate with other people, right? And they're exploiting that for ad space, to
Right.
sell us stuff, right? And that's problematic. So for me, the interest is to then find moments in time in the cultural context that I'm familiar with, that were better than that, and then see, well, what can we actually extract from that we can bring into the present and the future. And added to all of this is, of course, also the cultural context for this. For me, is that I have been raised with, it wasn't called True back then, but it came to be called True, right? This is part of me, my growing up through the 80s and 90s, and then eventually True becomes a word. It's actually kind of funny because the word True was what Danish scholars would call the pre-Christian religions of Scandinavia in the 19th century. Then it's inherited into Icelandic, and then becomes a term for, you know, the revival of the pre-Christian religion that is now being used everywhere, and re-enters Danish vocabulary that way as well, as asatro. So I think it's an incredibly problematic term because it's entirely defined within this context of belief. This is what you would also see if you Google it here in North America. You will see somebody explaining it as the belief in the Aesir, right? And that belief, credo, as we know it from Latin, is an entirely Christian invention. And having belief is something that belongs to the Christian religion, and that's not what it's about in traditional knowledge systems, traditional systems of relating to the world. It's exactly that. It's relating to the world, establishing relations in different ways, as we just talked about, establishing relations with ancestors, establishing relations with natural entities, understanding your personal place in context of all of these relations. And when you start digging into Old Norse mythology, you'll see so many interesting references to bonds of all kinds of bonds and threads that go in the world. And when Ragnarok comes, when chaos comes, that's when the bonds break. There are direct references to that. Even the gods are called bonds.
Yeah. And that is what, sorry to interrupt, but just a phrase that you use a lot in your, well, in here, but it's in the Sacred Flame and everything, which I really like, but it begs sort of describing a little bit, is Nordic story world. So this is what you're talking about, right? When we go back and look at the Nordic story world, this is what we find.
Yeah. I use the term Nordic story world because mythology is problematic. Like when I say myth, nowadays, I think the average person will think, oh, this is a story that's not true. Right. In the context of scholarship on religion, the term myth has much more import. First of all, it doesn't mean that it's not true. It usually means, when you talk about a myth, it means a actually incredibly important narrative, right? But has the implication that the entities that are mentioned, the figures of the story, are not real, right? That's why it's still used in scholarship. Obviously, that's not how it would be perceived by the people who are telling this story in a meaningful context in their society.
Yeah.
They did not sit there and go like, yeah, let me tell you the story about Thor fishing for the Midgard serpent. And by the way, we all know Thor didn't exist, of course. Like, no, like that's not how that worked, right? So the term myth for the average person means lie, essentially,
Right.
but lie, but a great story, perhaps. And
Right.
the term myth for scholars means important stories that are essential to what we're studying, but we don't believe in them, right?
Right. Right.
And then we have also with that in the scholarship of religion, scholarship of literature, and so on, we have this tendency to separate everything into genres,
Yeah.
right? Which is also incredibly problematic, and again an invention of the 19th century more than anything else. And this is why we have saga literature, and we have Eddic poetry, and we have Snorri Sturluson's Edda, and we should keep all of these different genres separate, right? Even though they're about the same material, like right. The best example is Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, right? He shows up in poetry, he shows up in skaldic references, he shows up in Eddic poetry, he shows up in Snorri Sturluson's Edda in short form, and then he also has a whole saga, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So ultimately, what I like to do is call this the Nordic story world, because this is a universe of narration. There's a universe that where everything makes sense once you exist in it, essentially, right? And it doesn't matter if the story about Sigurd the Dragon Slayer is narrated in poetic form over here, or you know, an extended prose narrative, an epic form over here, because it all comes together as meaningful knowledge about our world, right? That's the point of his story as this hero, and the story about his ancestors, the Volsungs and so on, right? Like all of that has import for us as we exist right here, right now, right? That's the point of the retelling of the story. And then of course we have to dig into what that means for, you know, the version that has survived, in like the Völsunga saga, for instance, what is written in the early 1400s, the only surviving text, right? And well, what does that mean? What kind of importance did it have when it was written down, and all that stuff, and what meaning can it have to us today? And that's where I love, you know, extracting knowledge, I would say, from all of this, because I think there's a lot to say about all of this. And if nothing else, if we want to say that these texts are detached from us today because we are living in an entirely different society and all that stuff, is like, yeah, sure, but then we have a period of at least 100, 200 roughly years of people bringing them back and recontextualizing them, like Wagner did, right? Like the Norwegian historians have done with the king's sagas, like Icelandic historians have done with the Icelandic family sagas, like Danish historians have done with legendary sagas, like Tolkien has done with like taking all of this stuff and then reconfiguring it into his own little universe of the Lord of the Rings, which he wanted to be a mythology for the English, the Anglophone world, right? So yeah, it's, I mean, even if we want to sort of like put that distance between us now and that material, and for instance in a scholarly sense, we can't ignore the fact that this material has circulated in our populations in a very meaningful way for the last 200 years. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Or even some of the older stuff we were just talking about, right? With even Aurelius or others, you know, throughout time. I mean, it's part of expressing, documenting, whatever word you want to use, but you know, the human experience. And there is, I mean, and this is I don't know if it's not, I guess debate maybe is the right word, you know, in the historian community about about context, because I'm always on, and people who've listened to this podcast know before, like I'm on about historical context does matter. I mean, we don't live 1,000 years ago, but then there's, so there's the recognition of that. But then on the other side of it, it's like, yeah, but we're all still human beings. And at the core somewhere, there's got to be an understanding of, experience of what it means to be a human being in the world, that we can latch onto, right? And still relate to in some ways. So, I mean, I think your book is great. I mean, I highly recommend it to people. I mean, you can read it in an afternoon, and I hope you don't take this wrong, but I mean, there's this whole series of like, fill in the blank subject for dummies, right? So, and that also true for beginners, right? But I mean, it is kind of like that too, because it's really, it's a very good basic description of what this is, where it comes from, and then how these things can still be relatable and applied in our modern context. But also, I think importantly, and this is a good thing about your Sacred Flame podcast as well, it's like why it's important to be to do this, because well, actually, to quote you to you, is that the 21st century is certainly a period of revival of ancient spiritualities across the world. And yeah, right. I mean, there's got to be a reason for that. I think if you're alive, and particularly in the Western world, but of course, if you're in the Western world, what we do has a ripple effect everybody else practically. It's kind of like there is a feeling, at least for me, of an emptiness or a something that is a hole that is needing to be filled. And I think the forgetting of the past, full scale, like we think we need to do on some level. And I think this is also talking about the postmodern or the post-industrial. I mean, the Enlightenment and what created that whole period of time, and this idea about progress and everything for progress and everything for the future. And like you say, new technology, always by default good, like we're marching forward into this golden age rather than looking back at a golden age, because that's a dumb thing to do. And it's kind of like, that's just so baby with the bathwater kind of thinking in my mind. It's like there's usefulness in all of it. You just have to sort of figure out where that is and begin to apply it. And so I don't know. I mean, I can
if I can attach a comment to that, I would say that it's actually incredibly important to remember the past, and we are seeing very real examples of this right now in the tech industry. For instance, self-driving cars. What problem do we have with self-driving cars? Well, we have the fact that this technology isn't perfect. We don't know if it's ever going to be perfect, and there's so many variables involved in a car driving down the road, right? Yeah. That it can be difficult to anticipate how to construct that AI and all of that stuff, right? And so what do we have? Well, there was like one, I don't remember who it was, but some prominent CEO of some tech company who said something on I think it was on social media, maybe it was an article. Well, the solution to this would be to put them on some kind of rail tracks. It's like, great, so you reinvented the train, right? This is an example of loss of historical knowledge.
Right.
Yeah. Like what was it, Elon Musk that was like, oh yeah, let's create some kind of like what?
Called the Boring Company. Let's put tracks and go underground. It's like, yeah, that's called the metro in Paris.
Yes, exactly, right. I think also Elon Musk had a solution for carbon monoxide in the atmosphere, basically saying that, well, we just need some kind of like system to take it out of the atmosphere. And it's like, oh, so you're reinventing trees. Great. Yeah, why just don't plant some trees, guys? So this is what happens, and I'm not calling these people who say this kind of stuff stupid or anything like that. This is what happens when you are too insular in your thinking, and you don't first of all have permeable boundaries to the rest of the community around you, and also to the past, to your ancestors who rode trains, right? Because if you had that, then you would already know that this is a great solution, to have trains rather than cars.
But you would miss the opportunity to think, man, I'm so smart. I'm inventing.
Right. Yes,
Um,
exactly. And that's I guess the problem of the modern ideology of the individual, right? The individualism.
Luckily for us, we get to keep reinventing the wheel, and we're great at it.
Right.
Well, okay, so I mean, I want to be respectful of your time. We've gone on for like an hour and a half here, but I mean, I have just like one kind of final sort of thought experiment, and I know we've kind of gotten at bits and pieces of it all over the place, but if you could sort of, encapsulate it down into a few sentences, like if a Nordic person from the year 800 got into a time machine and then landed in, Denver or Boulder or Portland or New York or whatever, and spend a little bit of time, what do you think they would notice about how the way we inhabit the world?
I think that they would look at our ways of life and the things that we do, and then they would shake their heads and they would say, man, you guys are lonely. You live like sad lives. Because and this is also the reason that I say that is because that is exactly the reaction that we've gotten from, like, over the last 100 years or so, from indigenous peoples coming to Western countries. What was it? There was someone from a indigenous population in the Amazons, a leader of some kind. It's a vague memory, who came to London and saw how people lived there, and was like, how can I help these homeless people? What can we do? Like this person was like obviously very strongly emotionally affected by the way that people live there, right? Looking at this, saying this is not right, right? Having very little experience with urbanized societies of this kind prior to them coming to London. And this is so I would assume that people living in the 800s in Scandinavia would have similar experiences, because they lived in similar ways,
Yeah.
as many indigenous populations still do today, or are trying to keep up doing.
Yeah.
Right? Because keep in mind that our types of societies, the ones that we live in now, they're encroaching upon them and undermining their ways of life, right? So yeah, I think a 9th century Scandinavian coming to Western, it doesn't even have to be here in the US. It could also be in Scandinavia.
Yeah.
They would get depressed,
Yeah.
essentially, and say, you guys need to do better, or how can I help you?
Or they'd say, where's that time machine? I want to go back to
Exactly.
the 9th century. Oh, well, I hate to end it on such a sad note, but I guess we got work to do. And I mean, thank you so much for what you do. I mean, I've really enjoyed my conversations with you, and reading your writings, and also listening to your podcast. And I do think that, I mean, the first thing, in order to try to fix a problem, is awareness of the problem. And I mean, I think you're definitely, helping people to do that, and also, postulating some of these ways that we can learn from the past in order to help make a better future.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I just hope to give people, especially with the Sacred Flame podcast, some tools, essentially. That's what it's about: giving people tools in their minds to navigate their world.
Good. Yeah. Okay. And I'll put links to all of it in the notes for the podcast, and so people can check it out. And yeah. So
Awesome.
anyway.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. So yeah, until next time, I guess it would be great to continue the conversation at some point, I think.
I would be happy to. Thank you for inviting me on the podcast.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.